The Berlin Wall was constructed on August 13, 1961, during the peak of the Cold War, when the world was sharply divided into two ideologically opposed blocs. On one side was the Western Bloc, consisting of the United States and its NATO allies, supporting capitalism, democracy, and individual freedoms. On the other side was the Eastern Bloc, led by the Soviet Union, representing communism, state control, and a system that promised equality through government intervention in all aspects of life. This division, marked by the Berlin Wall, became the most iconic symbol of the Cold War. After World War II, Germany was divided into four sectors controlled by the United States, France, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union. Berlin, which lay in the Soviet-controlled part of Germany, was also split into four sectors. However, tensions between the Soviet Union and the Western Allies escalated quickly, leading to a division of ideology. The East, under Soviet control, became the German Democratic Republic, GDR, while the West became the Federal Republic of Germany, FRG. By 1949, this division was permanent. Berlin, the capital of Germany, became the focal point of the Cold War. It was divided by both ideology and physical barriers. The western sector of Berlin, although surrounded by East Germany, was supported by the Western Allies and became a center of capitalism, free speech, and democratic freedoms. On the other hand, East Berlin, controlled by the Soviet-backed East German government, followed a communist system that restricted freedoms, with a focus on centralized control of the economy, state surveillance, and propaganda. The Berlin Wall was built not only as a physical barrier, but also as an ideological one. The East German government argued it was needed to protect their people from the supposed decadence and corruption of the West. In reality, it was meant to prevent the massive exodus of East Germans to the more prosperous and free West, particularly West Berlin, which became a beacon for those seeking a better life. Over 3 million East Germans had already fled to the West between 1949 and 1961, many of them crossing through Berlin. As a result, the Berlin Wall stood as a symbol of oppression, dividing families, friends, and communities. The wall was a physical manifestation of the Iron Curtain, the ideological divide that separated the free world from the communist world. In the East, people lived under strict government control, with little to no freedom of expression, constant surveillance, and severe restrictions on travel. In the West, however, capitalism and freedom flourished, offering opportunities for people to live more freely and with greater prosperity. For nearly 30 years, the Berlin Wall remained in place. During this time, countless East Berliners risked their lives trying to escape to the West, often in dramatic ways, by digging tunnels, jumping out of windows, or even attempting to climb the wall itself. Many were caught and imprisoned, while others tragically lost their lives in the attempt. The wall wasn't just a barrier in Berlin. It represented the global divide between two opposing worldviews. The US and the Soviet Union were engaged in a battle for global dominance, and Berlin became one of the most hotly contested locations in this ideological struggle. The Berlin Airlift of 1948 to 1949, where the Western Allies flew supplies into West Berlin after the Soviets blockaded the city, showed how critical Berlin was to the geopolitical situation. The tension in Berlin reflected the broader conflict between democracy and authoritarianism that characterized the Cold War. The Soviet Union, under the leadership of Joseph Stalin, sought to spread communism across Eastern Europe, while the United States aimed to prevent this expansion, leading to a series of proxy wars and diplomatic standoffs that kept the world on edge for much of the mid-20th century. But by the 1980s, things were starting to change. The Soviet Union was weakening under the leadership of Mikhail Gorbachev, who introduced reforms like glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, which allowed for more freedom of expression and started loosening the government's tight grip on Eastern Europe. These changes contributed to dissatisfaction in East Germany, where protests were growing louder. The people wanted change. They wanted the freedom to travel, to speak, and to live without constant surveillance. The wall, which had stood as a stronghold of Soviet control, started to lose its significance. Economic struggles, public unrest, and political changes were making the East harder to control. The East German government found it increasingly difficult to maintain the status quo. Then, on November 9, 1989, an announcement was made. East Germans would be allowed to travel freely to the West. This wasn't an immediate removal of the wall, but it was enough to spark chaos. People surged toward the wall, and within hours the gates were opened and the wall was torn down by jubilant citizens. The fall of the Berlin Wall was a momentous event, signaling the end of the Cold War, the reunification of Germany, and the collapse of the Soviet Union. It became a symbol of freedom, unity, and the triumph of democracy over authoritarianism. But what if the Berlin Wall had never fallen? What if the East and West had remained separated, and the wall had stayed in place as a permanent marker of the divide? To understand the impact, we first need to recognize how deeply the Berlin Wall was embedded in the geopolitical landscape of the time. The wall wasn't just a physical barrier. It was a powerful symbol of the ideological divide between the communist East and the capitalist West. For nearly 3 decades, it separated families, friends, and a nation. On the one side, the prosperous and democratic West, led by the United States and NATO. On the other, the impoverished totalitarian East, controlled by the Soviet Union. Had the Berlin Wall never fallen, Germany would have remained a divided country. East Germany, the German Democratic Republic, would have continued as a communist state under the tight control of the Soviet Union, with the wall acting as a physical reminder of the ideological conflict between communism and capitalism. The capitalist West would have continued to thrive with the support of Western Europe and the United States. But the contrast between the two sides would have only deepened, making it even harder for East Germans to imagine a better future. In East Germany, the authoritarian regime would have continued to suppress political dissent. The government would have remained under the influence of the Soviet Union, preventing the kind of reforms that Gorbachev introduced in other Soviet satellite states in the late 1980s. Glasnost and perestroika were processes that helped bring about the end of the Cold War. But without the fall of the wall, these reforms might have been delayed or never fully realized in East Germany. The people living in East Germany, who were already unhappy with the oppressive regime, would have continued to face a lack of basic freedoms, economic stagnation, and a government that controlled nearly every aspect of life. The East German economy would have struggled to keep up with the Western world, further widening the gap between the two sides. The East Germans would have continued to be caught in a system that restricted their opportunities, and many would have still dreamed of escaping to the West, as they had done during the height of the Cold War. The effects of the wall staying up wouldn't have been limited to Germany. The entire region of Eastern Europe was influenced by Soviet power, and many of the countries that had gained independence in 1989, such as Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, would have faced a much tougher road ahead. The collapse of the wall played a pivotal role in accelerating the collapse of communist regimes throughout Eastern Europe. Without this moment, countries like Poland might have faced much stronger resistance to democratic reforms, and the Soviet Union could have held on to power for even longer. In Europe as a whole, the absence of the wall's fall would have meant that the European Union would have struggled even more to integrate Eastern European countries. The EU might not have been able to expand as rapidly, and the integration of Eastern Europe into the European community could have been delayed by years or even decades. The European project, which aimed to unite the continent economically and politically, would have faced significant challenges if the wall remained a symbol of division. On the global stage, the Cold War could have persisted longer. The United States and the Soviet Union would have remained locked in a bitter rivalry, and the nuclear arms race might have continued for much longer. The arms control agreements that helped to reduce nuclear weapons could have stalled, and tensions between the two superpowers would have been even more pronounced. This would have affected global diplomacy, and conflicts in regions like Africa, Asia, and the Middle East could have been further influenced by the divide between East and West. In short, if the Berlin Wall had never fallen, the trajectory of European and world history would have been vastly different. Germany would have remained divided, the European Union's expansion would have slowed, and the Cold War might have dragged on for decades longer. The people of Eastern Europe would have continued to live under oppressive regimes, with no clear path to, as the Soviet Union struggled to maintain control over its satellite states. It could have used the Berlin Wall as a tool to strengthen its hold on Eastern Europe. The idea of a unified democratic Europe could have been pushed further out of reach, with the people living in Eastern Europe continuing to suffer under authoritarian regimes. Another consequence would be the delay in technological and cultural exchange between East and West. The wall's fall led to the rapid exchange of ideas, technologies, and cultural movements between the formerly divided parts of Europe. Without it, East Germans would have missed out on the economic advancements of the West, such as the rise of information technology and the Internet. In fact, Eastern Europe as a whole could have remained stuck in the pre-digital age for much longer. In short, if the Berlin Wall had never fallen, the trajectory of European and world history would have been vastly different. Germany would have remained divided, the European Union's expansion would have slowed, and the Cold War might have dragged on for decades longer. The people of Eastern Europe would have continued to live under oppressive regimes, with no clear path toward democracy and freedom. The wall, which was a symbol of division, would have remained an obstacle to the peaceful future that many people longed for. Ultimately, the fall of the Berlin Wall was more than just the physical demolition of a concrete barrier. It was the beginning of a new chapter in world history. If that moment hadn't come, the world today might look very different. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more fascinating stories about history's greatest figures and events.